Welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. We're going to be looking at building a data protection culture at your school or MAT. My name's Stacy Williams and Adam Halsey is going to be presenting this alongside, and we're both from Invicta Law. So just running through the agenda, what we're going to cover in this session. So we're going to look at why is a good data protection culture important? What does a good culture look like? And also what does a bad one look like? Overcoming any challenges for a data protection culture, and also building, monitoring and maintaining the right data protection culture.
Thanks, Stacey. So I think the point to start is definitely the why piece. That's where we've always got to start, particularly with something like data protection. So why are we saying it's so important to build a positive data protection culture in your school and to dedicate the time and resource to that? Is it not just enough to take advice from your DPO on dealing with data breaches, on dealing with those subject access requests, on doing the DPIAs, on queries about consents and a lawful basis and all the rest of it? Surely that's the ticket. Well, no, what we want to explain today is that isn't enough. It's really important to have a positive data protection culture in place that underpins all of that. And we've tried to do a little graphic on the screen here that really illustrates that. What we're saying is that if we have that positive data protection culture in place at your school or your multi-academy trust, as you can see, we're saying that that will in turn encourage quality decision making by members of staff when they're handling student, staff, parent, carer, personal data. That might be good decision making in respect of how to respond to a data breach, how to handle a piece of information, whether it be online or hard copy, how to work on a particular subject access request, i.e. redacting or not redacting a certain piece of information. And as per the graphic, once we've then got that good quality decision making in place across the piece, that is going to increase trust among our stakeholders, our parent community, staff, governors, pupils, of course, as well. And it will also reduce the risk of legal or regulatory action, of course, because if we're getting things right, far more often than not on the likes of data breaches, on the likes of our handling of subject access requests, that is going to reduce the chance of those things happening. That in turn, when we've got less of that stuff to worry about, means less time spent dealing with some of the more avoidable data protection issues. Data protection is a big thing, it's here to stay, but there are pieces, certainly negative aspects of it, that if we've got the right systems, the good culture in place, we can reduce the risk of things going wrong, and we can be far more positive about it. And then coming full circle at the top, we're saying that once we get to that place where people are realizing that no, data protection isn't just this sort of irritating, time-consuming thing, because we're spending now less time on dealing with all the issues, all the negative, that in itself is going to go full circle and keep contributing towards that positive data protection culture at your school or your multi-academy trust. So we promised that we'd set out what a good data protection culture and what a bad data protection culture might look like at your school to start us off. So a few key points there on what a very positive data protection culture is going to look like. Well, first of all, and it probably applies to any type of culture, whether it's data protection or anything really, but people feeling empowered to speak out if something goes wrong. That's ever so important. And of course, that's something that will no doubt tie into the overall culture at your school or multi-academy trust. We're not sat here, Stacey and I, pretending that data protection culture is something that just sits away on its own, completely independent of the wider culture within your organisation. But really, really ever so important that we do have that culture where staff will speak out if something goes wrong. For example, if there's been a data breach. Also very important and reflective of a good data protection culture is when after things go wrong, we're looking to address the root cause of the problem rather than apportion blame if those things do go wrong. Also, a good sign of a positive data protection culture is when we've got that really proactive approach to data protection matters, as insofar as is possible. So, for example, working towards our general GDPR compliance, but also, as we'll touch on again a bit further in the session, the data protection impact assessment process, or the DPIA process. That's going to help support what is a very proactive approach to data protection at our school or MAT. Very much linked to that is ensuring that whatever measures, protocols we've got in place at the school to support us with our data protection endeavours, let's make sure they don't just sit in a list somewhere that gets put on a shelf and no staff at the school really know about. Let's really work to make sure that those measures are embedded into all your processes at schools. In other words, data protection shouldn't just be an afterthought. And always highly important and really high up the list, training and guidance. When we as the school have got good training and guidance in place, the awareness is there among our staff community. That's where we're showing on the data protection front, as well as many other fronts, that we're in a really good place on the culture piece. So let's be negative for a couple of minutes now. And it won't surprise you to see or to know that a poor data protection culture, some of the items we've got there are very much just the reverse of what we had listed on the previous slide. So absolutely, if you believe at your school you have a situation where data breaches are happening, but they're just not being reported, they're being covered up, that is going to be, I'm afraid, a red flag for a poor data protection culture at your school. There are many people, when talking to Stacy and myself in the role, such DPO role that we undertake, who believe that the biggest nightmare for a DPO is a data breach, is being told that data breaches have happened. And actually, that's not the case. Not the case at all. The biggest nightmare for a DPO, I can promise you, is the fear that data breaches are happening, but leadership at the school and ourselves as DPO just aren't being made aware of those breaches, because that can have really quite severe consequences, both for individuals and for the school or MAT as a whole. And certainly, if that's the case, we do have cultural problems, at least on the data protection side of things, in our organisation. It's also true to say that you're never going to have a positive or be able to build a positive data protection culture at your school if the approach to something going wrong on the data protection front is one of looking to see who to blame. Whose fault was it? Was it Stacey's fault? Was it Adam's fault? And also true to say that if we have a situation at our school where data protection is only a very last minute consideration, rather than something that's embedded into our way of thinking across the staff community at the school, and it's something that's not embedded into our projects and our processes, then yes, in those cases, we're again showing worrying signs of poor data protection culture within the organisation.
Now we're going to look at what challenges there are to building a positive data protection culture at your school or MAT. Adam's going to go into a couple of these in a bit more detail, but just as a high level, so we're aware time and resources is probably a big challenge. So a lot of you will have different roles in your job title. So all of those roles will be competing for your time and resources. So we completely acknowledge that a big challenge will be time and resources to look at data protection and the culture. Also, perception of data protection as being an obstacle and not an enabler. So a lot of people might think that it's a stop to things rather than, being able to go ahead with certain suppliers, for example, or software. High staff turnover can also be quite a big challenge. How do you keep that consistent culture if you have quite a lot of staff moving on out of your school or MAT? How do you keep those new staff who replace them up to date and buy into your data protection culture? That leads on to communications. How do you keep everyone aware of any data protection updates, your policies, your procedures, any guidance, any updates? How do you get that communication out to all your staff members? Also complexity, data protection can be complex in different aspects. Again, how do you deal with that? How do you make sure that people are not sitting there struggling, not speaking out and asking for help? How do you help people navigate data protection? And then lastly, about AI and fast moving changes in technology. Obviously, AI is a big thing. It's moving through rapidly. A lot of people are trying to use it. And I expect quite a few people at your schools will want to onboard those AI products that help them with their job role. Again, data protection needs to be at the forefront of everyone's minds. Are we Are we keeping data safe? Are these AI models keeping data safe? Where is that data going? Adam will go into it in a little bit more detail in a moment. But yeah, we acknowledge these are all challenges to building that positive data protection culture. And then just a question we want you to consider. So when you have a spare moment and take away from this webinar is, what do you consider to be the biggest barriers to building a strong data protection culture at your school? So have a little think about that. What are do you have good aspects of data protection culture? Is there any bad aspects? What can you improve? And how can you improve that? How can you, involve your staff in that data protection culture and move that forward?
So as Stacey has said, just wanted to really go into a few of those challenges in a little more detail and explore them. So starting with the awareness and communication piece, well, I think one thing that a lot of people find is that sometimes if you have one particular person leading on something, it could be your data protection lead within your school, they're going to be doing some sterling work, but sometimes, and it's not a reflection on any given individual, but just in organizations, in businesses, hearing from the same person and just hearing something from the same person over and over again, that voice can, without realizing it, sometimes become quite stale and just become a bit too much part of the furniture, or sort of somewhere there in the background. Actually, fresh voices on the subject might be something that could help get the messaging out there on data protection. So if you have a data protection lead, for example, in your school, who may also double, triple, quadruple up as your business manager or HR manager, or however many hats they might be wearing, might be sensible to actually say at the start of a given term, do you know what? We're going to get all the heads of department to discuss this, to send a message round, maybe just an email around to all the people within their teams or areas. And just sometimes that realization that, oh, hang on, we've got this person's now talking about it as well. That can sometimes really shift perception as to how important a topic is. So I would say do consider those fresh voices and try and use that to your advantage within your school. We're saying there as well, be visual. And what we mean by that is use those posters, use the tech we've got in front of us, maybe change the screensaver. Maybe if you've got a data protection awareness month or a particular part of the year, maybe use the opportunity to get some posters out there, get those screensavers in there. And this isn't to try and make the visuals in your school mundane or non-teacher friendly or non-staff friendly in any way. But really importantly, as people walk around the organisation, as they walk around the building, they actually do have awareness of how important these things clearly must be to the school and clearly must be to the leadership of the school if we're bothering to put posters up and screensavers up about this. And one thing Stacey and I have found too, going to the third point below, really in trying to build that culture piece on data protection, important to link data protection back to safeguarding. Safeguarding, a huge amount of work we know goes in, day out to safeguarding students at your schools and multi-academy trusts. But how does data protection link into that? And let's be clear, if we're doing well on the data protection front, that's only supporting our safeguarding processes and our safeguarding outcomes. That's not hindering them in any way. So as we've said there, let's be clear with all staff of the need to look after personal data to safeguard those individuals. We cannot safeguard those individuals if we're not safeguarding their information. So let's make sure that that link between the two, data protection and safeguarding, is made in the minds of all our staff. And finally, on that particular piece, ensure everyone is aware of the cost of getting it wrong. Now, that's a slightly more negative point, I appreciate, and it sounds a little bit daunting when said in a particular way. But it is really important, I think, because with all the very brutal sounding terms and regulations that get referred to within a school or an education environment, thinking about the education regulations, thinking about Ofsted, for example, GDPR can sometimes be forgotten or just thought of as some form of fairly unknown thing in the background, or just something that's guidance. But really important to remember that the data protection legal framework is underpinned by two quite beastly pieces of legislation in the form of the UK GDPR, which is then supplemented by the Data Protection Act. Now, the GDPR sets out worst case scenario for those organisations that are getting it terribly wrong in respect of data breaches, remember, they can be fined up to £17.5 million. And even if we're not talking about fines, even if we're just talking about the reputational damage that a data breach or poor data protection practices may do for a school and for the wider community, think about the cost of that too. So really important to make sure, while I'm not wanting to be overly negative, that everyone is clear that there are costs of getting it wrong on the data protection front. This stuff is not simply just a nice to have. What about those first 2 points that Stacey raised in terms of those challenges in terms of building data protection culture? So the time and resources piece, but also that perception among people sometimes that data protection is just this sort of irritating obstacle that actually stops us in what we need to do as a school, when that's not the case at all. Again, I think the really important thing here is to just make sure that we're making that link in people's minds between our safeguarding and our data protection. Data protection is something that is going to help us enable our safeguarding processes. It's not there to hinder them. Make use of your DPO, whether that's Stacey and I in Invicta Law or whatever other DPO arrangements you have in place. Do make sure that you get the best out of the DPIA process. And you can do that by getting in touch with your DPO who will help you do that. The important thing there is that the risk with data protection impact assessments is they can very quickly just turn into an after the event exercise or a bit of a tick box exercise. And really, really important to set out that actually, even though it sounds a bit daunting, once set out by your DPO in terms of what you need to do, the DPIA process is actually ever such a useful tool to actually help us evidence some of our safeguarding and to help support our safeguarding of both pupils and their personal information. And we've said as a final point on that slide that good systems will certainly help, where data protection will certainly feel like a real burden for you and will really start to feel like an obstacle, as if we've not got those good platforms, those good systems in place to help us log and have oversight in everything, essentially. So what are all our data breaches? What are all the actions we've taken to mitigate the risks that might be caused by those data breaches? How have we handled recent subject access requests that have come into the school? Make sure that that's all able to be logged centrally, because that will certainly make data protection seem like something far more manageable relative to everything being thrown out in multiple different places. Now, staff turnover is a really, really interesting one, because clearly high staff turnover is not something that you're going to want at your school or multi-academy trust, and hopefully it's not something that you're currently suffering with. But with staff turnover, how do we address that, and how do we maybe not exactly use it to our advantage, but how do we make sure that we're getting in front of people nice and early with the data protection messaging when they come into the organisation? So let's take the opportunity to review our induction procedures and introduce the subject to new members of staff as soon as possible, ideally discussing it with them on their first day at your school. Now, as we say there, this will help ensure that new members of staff are aware right from the very beginning of their time at the school on just how severely, I guess, and just how much importance your school places on data protection. Now, that can only surely encourage good quality decision making as they proceed ahead with their time at the school. It will hopefully encourage them to ask the right questions of the right people. And that in turn is going to manage our overall risk at the school, isn't it? That's going to reduce our risk of people getting it wrong on the data protection front, because they're so aware from day one on just how important this stuff is to leadership at the school. So let's make sure we do make that point to people on their induction at the school, if that's not something that's already embedded into your induction procedures. I would say there that, of course, it goes without saying they should be doing their induction data protection training, just as all organisations when they start, but just an online training module on its own won't be enough. That really, you're going to need that discussion with someone, you're going to need it set out in the overall environment at the school, just how important the topic is and how important it is that we all try and get it right. What about artificial intelligence and other technological advances? Well, I think the reason we had to include this as a challenge is because you can't get away from the fact that as we move forward with AI, it's still quite rightly going to be seen as a form of high risk processing of personal data. You know, the potential of algorithms being used to process personal data, but not only that, but, you know, being used to potentially train train the models of companies that might not even be based within this country in many cases. So it is true, of course, that AI over time will bring, we hope, many opportunities for schools in terms of augmenting, supporting the role of the teacher to be able to deliver really great learning outcomes for your students. But it's also true we need to be aware of it on the data protection front. And that's not only from a technical perspective, also from the cultural perspective too, because there is this risk with AI that people, as they're not wanting their organization to be left behind, really do want to sort of run ahead and rush ahead with this stuff. But the risk there, if we go too quickly, is that the data protection piece gets forgotten about and it ends up again becoming an afterthought. So what we really, really want to do with AI, and the key couple of messages I think on this going forward, is not about data protection being the obstacle that's going to stop us getting AI in place, but it's about getting our staff, getting our people used to engaging the data protection officer well in advance of onboarding a new AI tool or product. The DPO, you know, and your data protection leads in your school should not be contacted after the event, or, you know, a day before the school wants to go live with a new piece of using a new supplier who might use AI in their processes. Get there in advance so that the DPO can help you with that DPIA process. They can help advise on risk and offer that risk-based pragmatic advice that, you know, is going to only help with the safeguarding piece, again, because we're looking after people's information here. But also at the same time, let's get that balance right, as we say. Let's try and raise awareness of both the opportunities on the one hand and the risks on the other hand of using AI tools and onboarding other new forms of technology.
Thanks, Adam. So let's look at how you build a data protection culture. So I will go into a little bit more detail on a couple of these in a moment, but starting from the top, as the first circle says, you know, it should really come from your executive team, your head teacher, your deputy head teacher, so that everyone knows how important this topic is. And, you know, there are policies and procedures and the law that we need to follow. Also set clear expectations for everyone at your school on that. So your policies, guidance, make sure, you know, it's clear what you expect of everyone to follow. Also keep everyone in the loop, you know, make sure everyone knows about your policies. You know, if people don't know about them, they're not going to follow them. Also quite important is audits, you know, check-ins to see if your policies are working and that they're being followed. Constant drip of feed of info. That's more of like trying to keep everyone up to date, keep data protection in their minds, rather than lots of information all at one go and then months and months with no information about data protection. It might be helpful just to have that constant drip feed of information so that, you know, it is in the forefront of people's minds. And as Adam's already mentioned, training, bringing training to life using real life examples that's happened at your school, just might help people learn about data protection better. So going into a bit more detail into some of these. So as I say, we must flow from the top. So try and cover data protection messaging in head teacher briefings to staff. Ensure it's an item on the agenda at board and governors meetings. And also make sure there's that support there. So if you've got DPO arrangements at your school or MAT or data protection leads, make sure they've got support from the head teacher or executive. Just make sure, you know, it just means it's important. It's an important topic that everyone needs to be aware of and follow any policies and procedures in place. Setting clear expectations, so making sure the process you want everyone to follow is clear in a policy, it's written down, people know where to find it. So for example, in respect of a data breach, you know, if someone realizes they've had a data breach, who do they report it to? You know, what process do they need to follow? You know, make sure that's written down and it's clear that everyone can understand that. And also, you know, if someone puts in a subject access request, make sure that deadline's on there, when they need to respond by, who they need to send that on to, and what the process is. Again, in respect to data breaches, make sure everyone knows what to expect from the follow-up procedure, looking at the root cause, why has that data breach happened, and also how you improve systems, how can we make sure that data breach doesn't happen in the future. Remember, you're not necessarily aiming to please everyone here. Not everyone's going to be happy with what procedure they need to follow. As we said previously, data protection can be complex, especially with DPIAs. Not everyone's going to be happy that they need to do certain things around data protection, but we need to provide clarity for everybody. Make sure they know what they're doing, know where to find information, and know who they need to report to. And just briefly about checking in on compliance. So if you have a procedure in place, so for example, reducing the risk of a data breach, is everyone following that procedure? So just do a little audit, have a look to see if that procedure is being followed. If it's not, do you need to change it? If it is, then great. You can tick that and say, great, we're following that procedure. And then emphasise that data protection is on the minds of leadership and therefore important topic. As I said a moment ago, make sure it comes from the top so everyone knows how important that is. And then training, again, really, really important. It's really important staff are trained on data protection. Really important at the beginning, as Adam said, if you can get that in your induction, make sure staff are aware at the outset about how important data protection is and all the different aspects they need to be aware of. And then ongoing training, make sure it's completed regularly. So ideally at the beginning of the autumn term, so, fresh back from the 6 weeks holiday or summer holidays, data protection in the front of their minds as they go on for the rest of the terms. Also try and link training content to real life school examples. So for example, if, previous data breaches that you've had, try and put that in the training so people understand what it looks like. Same with SARS. If you've had a particularly difficult SAR of what to disclose, what to redact, include that in your training so, people can relate to it and actually, if it does come across them in their day-to-day job, they can think, oh, I had training on this. I know what to do because I've seen this. And also encourage feedback from staff on data protection training provided. So once you provide the training, it's really good to get feedback because you can improve it for next time. If there's something else they're struggling with, you can put on more training to try and explain that certain aspect that's quite difficult. And just in respect of feedback, just feedback from staff generally on your policies and procedures. It's really helpful to get that feedback because people on the ground who are actually having that data protection issue or, having to complete that SAR, it's really important to get that feedback from them to try and improve processes.
Thanks very much, Stacey. So to summarise for our bite-sized session then, just to really create a small handful out of all of that of some takeaway points or actions for your school or multi-academy trust. And you can see we've tried to summarise it into 4 or 5 there. So the first thing, as was alluded to earlier in the session, if it's not there already, do please ensure that data protection is there from now on as an item on your board or governors meeting agendas. And the sorts of things you can have there are a bit of narrative about how the school or trust is doing on data breaches, how many have we had any that have been serious enough that have had to be reported to the ICO, that's the Information Commissioner's Office, but also on other matters such as ongoing projects that involve DPIAs, and things like subject access requests, cover off how many subject access requests or SARs have the school been receiving. Number 2, do refer, please, in your early as possible in the new term, in your staff briefings, to the importance of data protection. Get that messaging out there nice and early so that we all start as we mean to go on. The third point, just ensuring that awareness among the staff, and just make sure, again, that clarity point that Stacey mentioned, let's make sure everybody is clear on what the process is going to be. People might not like the follow-up process to data breach. They might not like the fact that we have to talk to people and we have to investigate things properly, or the school has to investigate things to work out how we can best prevent a breach from happening again. But schools will, or staff, I should say, will at least appreciate the clarity on what the process is. So make sure everyone's aware how data breaches are going to be treated. They're clear that no, they're not going to be immediately likely disciplined or sacked. But actually, we do need to look into this from a root cause perspective, make sure everyone's aware of that, make sure they're aware of why that's so important. And one of the more recent points Stacey made, in your next data protection refresher training session that you run, whether you commission somebody to do it for you, whether you do it in-house, let's make sure that those real life school examples are in there, something that's going to bring the whole topic to life for your staff cohort. And the final point, generally, let's make sure that if mistakes are made, and mistakes will be made because we're all human, whether we work in schools or law firms, let's generally make sure we're learning from our mistakes on the data protection front, whether it might be a data breach, whether it's something that we've not quite got right in dealing with a SAR or in complying with one of the data subject's rights. Let's learn from that mistake and let's turn what might seem like a negative situation now into your future advantage. And crucially linked with that, we must avoid that blame game. We know we're not getting it right when, if something's gone wrong on the data protection front, we're looking to blame individuals. We're looking to say, you know, that was Stacey, that was Adam, everything else is fine. Let's look deeper than that. And let's actually create something that puts us in a better place to reduce that risk and avoid similar errors going forward. So all that's left to say is thank you for joining us for this session. We hope you enjoyed it. Hope you find it useful and you've got some good takeaway points there. And we very much look forward, Stacey and I, to having you on the next webinar.
Thank you.